The Red River had claimed over 400 acres of low-lying timber during the spring floods of 1839, leaving Cypress Reach Plantation in a state of precarious isolation. Historical weather logs from the region indicate an unprecedented rainfall that season, transforming the arable land into a morass of black mud and stagnant pools. This environmental collapse set the stage for the human drama that followed, stripping away the veneer of prosperity that had long defined the Thorne family holdings. The receding waters left behind a residue of decay that seemed to permeate the very foundations of the estate. According to the correspondence of neighbors, the air grew thick with a miasma that no amount of drainage ditches could alleviate. The physical boundaries of the plantation seemed to contract, forcing the inhabitants into closer, more volatile proximity. It was within this claustrophobic atmosphere that the tragedy began to unfold, rooted in the desperate struggle for survival against an indifferent nature and a crueler governance. Elias Thorne assumed control of the estate following his father's passing in 1836, bringing with him a rigid, mathematical approach to agriculture that baffled the local gentry. He viewed the operation not as a legacy of tradition, but as a ledger of debits and credits, where human endurance was calculated alongside crop yields. Records from the time show a sharp increase in the acquisition of farming equipment and a simultaneous decrease in expenditures for slave welfare. Thorne was a man of the new century, educated in the philosophical economics of the East Coast, convinced that efficiency could solve the moral contradictions of his station. His demeanor was devoid of the paternalistic condescension common to his neighbors. Instead, he managed his labor force with the detachment of a machine operator. This absence of humanity proved far more corrosive than the explosive tempers of previous generations, creating a resentment that festered in the humid silence of the quarters. Standing in opposition to this industrial mindset was Hester, a woman whose age was recorded in the plantation ledger as 57, though her physical bearing suggested a durability that defied such metrics. She had arrived at Cypress Reach decades prior, transferred from a coastal trading post bearing the distinct scarification patterns of a region far inland. Her role within the slave community had evolved from field hand to a figure of spiritual authority, a transition that the overseers tolerated, primarily because it reduced the need for external medical expenses. Inventory lists from the period mention her requests for roots and herbs, items categorized trivially as garden supplies by the management. Yet, to the enslaved population, she represented a living connection to a lineage that predating the cane fields. Her presence in the infirmary was a silent rebuke to the master's pretensions of total control, a reminder that other powers held sway in the dark corners of the property. The friction between Thorne's desire for order and Hester's inscrutable influence became the central tension of the harvest season. Letters recovered from a cousin in Baton Rouge reveal Thorne's growing frustration with the superstitious compliances he observed on his land. He perceived Hester's nightly gatherings not as harmless ritual, but as a subversion of his authority, a theft of time and labor that belonged rightfully to him. The overseers, men of crude habit rather than insight, reported seeing candles burning long past curfew and hearing low rhythmic chanting that drifted from the edge of the woods. This challenge to his dominion was subtle but persistent, a spiritual current running beneath the surface of plantation life that Thorne found impossible to quantify or direct. It gnawed at his sense of competence, turning his analytical gaze toward the old woman and the shed she had claimed as her domain. That shed, a dilapidated structure originally intended for storing seed potatoes, had become the focal point of Hester's activities, a transformation that did not escape Thorne's notice. It sat at the boundary between the cleared fields and the dense, encroaching swamp, a liminal space that the other workers treated with a mixture of reverence and trepidation. Thorne's journal entries from late summer grew increasingly fixated on the building, describing it as a monument to ignorance that needed to be razed. He noted the strange smells that emanated from its rotting timbers and the odd, disjointed footpaths that led to its door. The structure represented an alternative hierarchy that he could not abide. For a man obsessed with lines and measures, the existence of a space he could not map or understand became an intolerable offense. The decision to act was not born of sudden anger, but of a calculated resolve to impose total rationality upon his surroundings. The escalating surveillance of Hester and her followers reached a breaking point when Thorne discovered that his directives regarding work schedules were being ignored in favor of her pronouncements. He learned that the field hands would sometimes delay their morning duties based on signs or omens she had interpreted, a direct challenge to the plantation's operational timeline. In his ledgers, he tallied the lost hours in monetary terms, converting the minutes of delayed labor into a debt that he intended to collect. This insubordination was framed in his mind not as a cultural practice, but as a labor strike, an economic rebellion that threatened the solvency of the entire venture. The pseudo-documentary record suggests that Thorne felt a moral imperative to crush this rival authority structure, viewing himself as an agent of progress, clearing away the debris of the past. The tension was no longer a quiet hum, but a roar in his ears. Hester, for her part, seemed to anticipate the coming conflict with a fatalism that unsettled those who sought her counsel. She moved through her duties with a terrifying calmness, her eyes fixed on horizons that others could not see. Testimony collected decades later from the descendants of the enslaved community recounts how she began distributing her few possessions: a carved bone necklace, a pouch of dried leaves, a smooth river stone, to the younger women. This divestment of property was a clear signal to those who knew her best. She did not expect to remain among them for long. Yet she refused to flee or to moderate her practices. Her resistance was not one of flight, but of confrontation, a decision to meet the encroaching hostility with the full weight of her spiritual inheritance. She prepared not for a battle of fists, but for a collision of worlds. The atmosphere on the plantation grew heavy, charged with the electricity of an approaching storm that refused to break. Thorne's visits to the fields became more frequent, his gaze lingering on Hester with a predatory scrutiny. He was waiting for a provocation, a clear violation of the rules that would justify the decisive action he had already planned. The workers felt the shift instinctively, their movements becoming more guarded, their conversations dying out whenever an overseer approached. Even the livestock seemed restless, horses stamping nervously in their stables, and dogs howling at the empty air. The plantation was holding its breath, suspended in a moment of terrible anticipation. The lush green of the cane stalks seemed to mock the vibrant life of the environment with the sterility of the social order, creating a contrast that was painful to witness. It was on a Tuesday, traditionally a day for administrative reviews, that Thorne finally decided to address the anomaly of the shed directly. He summoned his head overseer, a man named Pruitt, and dictated a memorandum regarding the sanitation of unauthorized structures. This document, later preserved in the parish archives, served as a legal pretext for what was to come, couching the destruction of a spiritual site in the dry language of property maintenance. Thorne was meticulous in his cruelty, ensuring that every action could be defended through the rigid framework of the regulations he so admired. He did not approach the situation with the hot blood of a brawler, but with the cold, precise logic of a judge delivering a verdict. The order was given to prepare for the demolition of the shed and the public correction of the woman who occupied it. As the sun began its descent, Casting long shadows across the muddy fields, the overseers assembled with torches and clubs, their faces set in grim masks of duty. They moved toward Hester's sanctuary, with the deliberate pace of men executing a warrant, the flickering light of their torches piercing the encroaching twilight. Hester emerged from the shed before they reached it, standing alone against the backdrop of the dark swamp. She made no gesture of submission, nor did she offer any resistance that a court would recognize. She simply stood, a solitary figure of immense dignity, watching the destruction of her life's work with eyes that reflected the dying light. The tension that had been building for months snapped into focus, crystallizing into a single moment of irreparable violence. The era of quiet suffering was over, and the era of terrible retribution was about to begin. The demolition crew, acting under the explicit verbal orders of Elias Thorne, did not hesitate in their execution of the destruction. They surged forward with a brute efficiency, tearing the rotting planks from the shed's frame with crowbars and hammers, reducing the sanctuary to a pile of splintered wood in a matter of minutes. Archival inventories from the period list the destroyed contents simply as assorted native curiosities, a clinical euphemism for the sacred artifacts shattered underfoot. Earthenware jars, containing complex herbal mixtures, were kicked open, their contents spilling into the mud to mix with the heavy clay soil of the Red River Valley. The crude altar, which had served as the spiritual anchor for the community, was hacked apart with axes, the deliberate violence of the act suggesting a desire to obliterate memory rather than merely enforce policy. This thorough erasure was a performance of power, designed to demonstrate that nothing on the land existed outside the master's dominion. As the debris settled, the overseers dragged the more significant relics into the yard to be incinerated, creating a pyre of cultural history that sent a column of black smoke into the humid air. Bundles of dried roots, feathers stained with ritual dyes, and small carved totems were tossed into the flames, producing a thick, acrid smoke that stung the eyes of the onlookers. A journal entry from a neighboring planter, who observed the smoke from a distance, noted the peculiar density of the cloud, describing it as hanging motionless in the air, as if the atmosphere itself had refused to accept the offering. The burning was not just a disposal method, but a statement of theological dominance, an attempt to purify the plantation through fire. Yet, the unnerving sense released by the burning herbs, sharp, metallic, and alien, suggested that the materials being destroyed possessed properties beyond the overseer's comprehension. Hester was seized roughly by the arms as she attempted to retrieve a small leather-wrapped bundle from the inferno, her body seized by the overseers before she could reach the flames. She did not struggle or claw at her captors. Instead, she stood rigid, her silence more damning than any scream could have been. This passivity confused the men, who were accustomed to resistance or pleas for mercy, and their grip tightened uncertainly as they marched her toward the central yard. The treatment of an elder woman with such brutality was a calculated insult, intended to strip away the respect she had commanded and reduce her to the status of common property. The enslaved population watched from the periphery, their faces masks of enforced blankness, though their eyes tracked every movement with a predatory intensity that Thorne, observing from his porch, failed to fully register. Elias Thorne descended from the big house to preside over the punishment, carrying with him a ledger book, as if he were conducting a routine audit rather than an execution. He approached Hester with the demeanor of a judge reading a verdict, his voice devoid of inflection as he listed the infractions: unauthorized assembly, theft of company time, and the practice of heathenish rituals on Christian soil. He asked her if she had any final words to explain her actions, a courtesy that was nothing more than a trap designed to elicit a confession of guilt. Hester looked at him, her gaze heavy with a recognition that unsettled him deeply. and spoke not in her own defense, but in a tone of finality. She acknowledged his power over her body, but her voice carried the weight of a warning that the physical destruction he was enacting would have metaphysical consequences he could not calculate. The whipping post, a scarred oak pillar that stood as the central totem of plantation discipline, became the stage for the violence that followed. Hester was stripped to the waist, exposing a back that was already a map of past suffering, a testament to decades of bondage that had failed to break her spirit. The preparation was conducted with a ceremonial precision. The bindings tightened just enough to restrict breathing without causing immediate injury. Thorne nodded to Pruitt, the head overseer, who uncoiled the whip with a practiced snap that silenced the ambient noise of the plantation. The tension in the yard was suffocating, the air pressure seeming to drop as the first strike was prepared. This was not merely punishment, it was a sacrifice, a deliberate spilling of blood to feed the thirsty earth, though the men holding the lash were too blinded by their own assumed superiority to see the ritual they were enacting. The first blow landed with a sickening wet sound that echoed off the whitewashed walls of the surrounding buildings, tearing fresh skin and drawing immediate blood. Pruitt wielded the whip with a mechanical rhythm, delivering the punishment not with passion, but with the efficiency of a man completing a distasteful chore. Thorne watched, his pen hovering over his ledger, to record the number of lashes, his face pale but composed. However, as the count rose past 5, a strange phenomenon began to occur, one noted by several witnesses in later oral histories. Hester did not scream. Instead, a low vibrating hum began to emanate from her throat, a sound so deep that it seemed to resonate in the chests of those standing nearby. This sound was not a moan of pain, but a note of invocation, a tuning of the spirit to a frequency that the brutality could not interrupt. By the 10th stroke, the blood running down Hester's legs had formed a dark pool in the packed dirt, soaking into the ground with an alarming speed. The soil of Cypress Reach, known for its heavy clay composition, should have held the liquid on the surface, yet it drank the blood as if parched. The hum emanating from the victim grew louder, morphing into a chant in a language that no white man on the property could identify, a dialect that predated the trade ships and the markets. The rhythm of the chant synchronized with the fall of the whip, transforming the instrument of torture into a percussive element in a dark liturgy. The overseers began to look at one another with unease, their confidence wavering, as they realized that their violence was not breaking the woman, but seemingly fueling a transformation. Thorne, disturbed by the lack of submission and the uncanny auditory response, ordered the punishment accelerated, commanding Pruitt to strike harder and faster. He sought to drown out the chanting with the noise of the whip, to reassert the dominance of physical pain over spiritual will. The count continued to 15, then 20. The flesh on Hester's back reduced to a ruin. Yet her head remained high, her eyes fixed on a point in the distance that only she could see. The psychological toll on the observers was becoming untenable. Several younger slaves had fainted, and even seasoned field hands turned away, unable to stomach the grotesque marriage of torture and trance. The violence had passed the point of correction and entered the realm of the profane, a desecration that seemed to thin the barrier between the living world and whatever lay beyond. When the final lash was delivered, and the count was officially recorded in the ledger as 25, the silence that followed was not relief, but a ringing, vacuum-like absence of sound. Hester was cut down from the post, her body collapsing into the dust, but the humming did not cease. It seemed to linger in the wood of the post itself, a residual vibration that made the timber groan. The overseer stepped back, wiping sweat and spatter from their faces, exchanging glances that betrayed a primitive fear. They had expected to kill a witch, but instead, They felt they had participated in the birth of something far more dangerous. The air around the whipping post felt ionized, charged with the static of a coming storm, though the sky remained clear. Two women, acting on a silent directive from the crowd, rushed forward to gather Hester's unconscious form, lifting her with a desperate gentleness that contrasted sharply with the brutality of the overseers. They bore her away toward the quarters, leaving a trail of dark droplets in the dust that marked the path of her removal. Thorne watched them go, his hand shaking slightly as he closed his ledger, the dry click of the cover sounding like a gunshot in the quiet. He turned his back on the yard, marching toward the big house with a rigid posture that failed to conceal his agitation. He believed the matter was settled, the rebellion crushed, and the superstition excised from his property. But the trembling of his hands suggested a subconscious understanding that he had only opened a door he could not close. As the sun set, casting a bloody light over the plantation, the atmosphere shifted perceptibly. The birds that usually filled the twilight with song remained absent, and the usual chorus of insects fell silent, creating a void of sound that was heavy and oppressive. The scorched earth where the shed had stood seemed to radiate a coldness that defied the lingering heat of the day. The destruction of the physical altar had not eliminated the power it represented. Rather, the violence had acted as a catalyst, stripping away the containment of the ritual site and releasing the energy into the wider environment. The pseudo-documentary evidence of the time, including personal diaries of the Thorne family, references a sudden unexplained drop in temperature that evening, a meteorological anomaly that heralded the shift from the political to the supernatural. The plantation was no longer merely a site of labor. It had become an altar itself. Medical reports from the quarters later confirmed that Hester's pulse was thready and erratic as she lay on a pallet of rough burlap, her back a ruin of exposed tissue. The women tending her used clean rags and well water, but the sheer volume of blood loss suggested a terminal prognosis. According to the oral history of the Cypress Reach descendants, the air in the cabin grew heavy and difficult to breathe, as if the oxygen were being consumed by an invisible fire. Hester drifted in and out of consciousness, her lips moving in silent conversation with entities unseen by the watchers. The atmosphere was thick with the copper tang of blood and the pungent aroma of medicinal roots that did little to mask the scent of impending death. This period of quiet suffering was a brief interlude, a gathering of breath before the plunge into the supernatural abyss. Just after midnight, a change overcame the invalid that defied the physiological capabilities of a woman in her condition. Hester's eyes snapped open, the irises rolled back to expose the whites, and she sat bolt upright with a strength that should have been impossible given her injuries. This violent resurrection sent the attendants scrambling backward in terror, clutching their amulets and whispering prayers. She did not speak to them or acknowledge their presence. Her gaze was fixed on the door, drawn by a gravitational pull that originated outside. The fever that had racked her body seemed to have been replaced by an icy coldness, her skin pale and dry. She stood, her spine straight despite the raw wounds, and began to walk toward the exit, moving with a jerky, marionette-like gait that suggested her body was no longer under her own control. The women attempted to bar her path, pleading with her to rest, but Heather pushed them aside with a single, imperious gesture that possessed a terrifying, magnetic force. She did not use physical strength. Instead, the air around her seemed to harden, creating a barrier that the others could not cross. "The way is open," she said in a voice that was not hers, a vocalization that sounded like stones grinding together deep within the earth. The command was absolute, rooted in a power that superseded the authority of the master or the laws of nature. Stepping out into the night, She left the safety of the quarters behind, walking barefoot toward the dense wall of cane that bordered the plantation. The transition from victim to vessel was complete, marking the point where the story shifted from a tragedy of oppression to a myth of retribution. The cane fields at Cypress Reach were notoriously difficult to navigate, a labyrinth of razor-sharp leaves and tangled roots that trapped the unwary. Hester entered this maze without hesitation, the stalks slicing into her arms and face as she pushed deeper into the darkness. She did not flinch from the lacerations, seemingly impervious to the pain that would have crippled a healthy man. The moonlight filtered weakly through the canopy, casting strange, elongated shadows that seemed to twist and dance in her wake. Biologists studying the local flora have noted that the cane in this region grows exceptionally tall, often exceeding 10 feet, creating a suffocating environment where sound is muffled and direction is easily lost. Yet, Hester moved with unerring precision, guided by an internal compass pointing toward a specific, invisible destination. She arrived at a clearing that the slaves called the Dead Ground, a circular patch of earth where nothing had grown for as long as the plantation had existed. Agricultural surveys from the 1830s had dismissed the spot as suffering from soil exhaustion, but local tradition held that it was a place where the barrier between worlds was thin. Hester fell to her knees in the center of this barren circle, the mud soaking through her thin garment. She began to dig into the earth with her bare hands, ignoring the dirt that packed into the open wounds on her back. The act was primal and desperate, a frantic excavation of the grave she had been denied. This was not a search for escape, but for a channel, a physical opening to the powers she had invoked. Smearing the dark mud mixed with her own blood onto the ground, she traced sigils of immense complexity, patterns that mirrored the scarification on her own skin. These symbols were not random scratches, but a coherent lexicon of invocation, a language that had survived the Middle Passage in the minds of the forgotten. Historians of comparative religion have identified similar geometric patterns in West African traditions, noting their use in summoning entities that govern justice and retribution. As she worked, the temperature in the clearing plummeted, a sudden and impossible drop that caused frost to form on the surrounding cane leaves. The rapid change in thermal dynamics was recorded in personal diaries of the Thorne family, who noted the unnatural chill that descended upon the estate without warning. Her chanting resumed, rising in volume until it drowned out the nocturnal sounds of the swamp. She called out to the old ones, the spirits that existed before the arrival of the missionaries and the overseers, entities that fed on the anguish of the oppressed and the arrogance of the powerful. She offered up the accumulated trauma of her 57 years, her lost children, her scarred flesh, and her stolen heritage, as a sacrifice. The prayer was not a plea for mercy, but a demand for balance, an invoice of suffering presented for immediate payment. The acoustic resonance of her voice seemed to vibrate the very ground, creating a low-frequency hum that rattled the windows of the big house nearly half a mile away. The response from the other side was immediate and catastrophic. A bolt of lightning, silent and blindingly bright, split the sky directly above the clearing, though no storm clouds were present. This was not natural electricity, but a discharge of spiritual static, a tear in the fabric of reality. The air pressure spiked, causing the ears of the watchers hiding in the distant quarters to pop, and the smell of ozone became overpowering. The earth beneath Hester seemed to ripple like water, the mud liquefying and bubbling as something vast began to surface from below. The boundaries of the material world were straining under the pressure of the entity attempting to cross over, creating a visual distortion akin to heat haze, but intensely cold. Hester's body arched backward in a posture of extreme seizure. her spine bending at an angle that would have been lethal to an unpossessed human. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, acting as a funnel for the dark energy pouring into her. The whites of her eyes turned a solid, impenetrable black, absorbing the meager moonlight and rendering her face a mask of terrifying darkness. This was the moment of total consumption, the death of the woman and the birth of the Avatar. Witnesses described seeing a shadow, detached from her body, rising tall above the cane, a silhouette that defied the laws of perspective and mass. The transformation was agonizing to behold, a violation of natural law that seared itself into the memory of all who caught a glimpse. The entity settled into the flesh, animating the ruined body with a terrible purpose. Hester, now the vessel, stood up, her movements fluid and predatory, the injuries to her back seemingly irrelevant to the mechanics of her motion. She turned her head toward the big house, her black eyes piercing through the miles of cane and darkness. The entity possessed a singular drive to deliver the message that the time of reckoning had arrived. The clearing, once a place of emptiness, now thrummed with a low-frequency vibration that caused the ground to tremble. The summoning was complete. The door had been opened, and what had stepped through was no longer bound by the restrictions of the living. She began the walk back toward the center of the plantation, her bare feet leaving prints of mud and blood that smoked slightly in the cool air. The cane parted before her, bending away as if sensing the predator in its midst. The transition from the dead ground to the inhabited areas marked the shift from ritual to retribution. The entity was not rushing. It moved with the deliberate, unstoppable pace of a glacier, confident in its power and savoring the fear it was about to inflict. The silence of the night was not broken by her approach, but deepened, as if the world itself was holding its breath in anticipation of the violence to come. The entity was coming for the master, and the plantation would never be the same. The first sign of the infiltration was not a sound, but a sudden piercing drop in temperature that swept through the big house like an invisible tide. Elias Thorne, who had been seated in his study reviewing the day's ledger entries, noticed the ink in his well beginning to freeze, a physical impossibility for the Louisiana climate in late spring. He stood, his chair scraping harshly against the floorboards, and moved to close the window, assuming a stray breeze had found its way inside. However, the glass was already fogged, obscured by a thick, pearlescent condensation that clung to the pane despite the warmth of the room. Upon inspection, he realized the fog was not formless. It bore intricate, swirling patterns that mimicked the ritualistic symbols he had ordered destroyed earlier that day. The pseudo-documentary record notes that Thorne attempted to wipe the glass, but the cold burned his fingertips, leaving a frostbitten sting that he would later recount in frantic journal entries. Before he could process the atmospheric anomaly, the sound of heavy, dragging footsteps resonated from the ground floor, vibrating up through the floorboards and into the soles of his boots. The rhythm was distinct, a slow, deliberate thud followed by a wet scrape, suggesting a limb that struggled to support its own weight or moved with a difficulty that defied the speed of the possession. Thorne's heart began to hammer a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a primitive instinct overriding his rational mind. He reached for the pistol kept in the drawer of his mahogany desk, a weapon he had never fired in anger, but now clutched with a desperate, sweating grip. The silence of the house, usually a comfort to him, had transformed into a suffocating vacuum, amplifying the intrusion of the ascending presence. He moved to the hallway, positioning himself at the top of the stairs, the pistol raised with trembling hands. "Who goes there?" he shouted, his voice cracking as it echoed down the stairwell. The command was intended to project authority, but the acoustics of the hallway betrayed him, returning a thin, wavering sound that revealed his terror. There was no immediate verbal response, only the continuation of that rhythmic ascent. Step, drag, growing louder with each passing second. The shadows in the hallway seemed to elongate and detach from the walls, pooling on the floor like spilled ink and creeping toward his position. Thorne fired a warning shot into the ceiling, the explosion deafening in the enclosed space, sending a shower of plaster dust drifting down like gray snow. He hoped the noise would startle an intruder, or perhaps summon the overseers from their cabins, but the plantation remained ominously still, as if the sound had been swallowed by the heavy air. From the darkness below, a voice finally answered, but it was not the voice of a human intruder. It was a composite tone, a layered resonance that sounded like Hester's timbre mixed with the grinding of stones and the rushing of deep water. "Your calculation is finished, Elias Thorne," the voice echoed, seeming to come from the walls themselves rather than a single source. The pistol in Thorne's hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy, a toy against the magnitude of the force approaching him. He backed away from the stairs, retreating toward his wife's chambers, his mind racing for a logical explanation, a prank, a runaway, a hallucination induced by stress. Yet, the deep cellular fear gripping him allowed for no such denial. The entity was not merely entering the house. It was invading his sanctuary of logic and order. Thorne burst into the master bedroom, slamming the door and locking it with fumbling fingers. His wife Clara sat up in bed, her face pale with confusion and premature terror as she took in her husband's disheveled state. "Elias, what is it? Has the river broken the levee?" she asked, her voice trembling. Before he could answer, the temperature in the room plummeted further, their breath misting in the air in thick, white clouds. The infant, Nathaniel, who slept in a cradle near the window, let out a sudden, sharp wail that was devoid of the usual hunger or discomfort. It was a scream of pure instinctual panic. The fire in the hearth, which had been banked for the night, extinguished itself instantly, the embers turning black and cold as if snuffed by an unseen hand. The door to the bedroom did not shatter or burst open. Instead, the wood began to groan and warp, the panels bulging inward as if subjected to immense pressure from the hallway. Thorne raised the pistol again, aiming at the center of the distortion. "Stay back," he yelled, though he knew his commands were meaningless. The lock clicked open of its own accord, the metal mechanism grinding as it turned, and the door swung inward to reveal the entity standing on the threshold. It wore Hester's form, but the resemblance ended at the flesh. Her posture was straight, defying the ruined muscles of her back, and her eyes were voids of absolute blackness that seemed to pull the dim light of the room into them. She stepped inside, and the shadows from the hallway flowed in around her ankles like a retinue of servants. "You burned the law, Elias," the entity said, its voice filling the room and pressing against the eardrums. "You thought the power was in the wood and the bones. You did not see that the power was in the blood you spilled." Thorne fired the pistol directly at the figure, the report deafening in the small space. The ball passed through the entity's chest without resistance, burying itself in the far wall with a dull thud. There was no blood, no recoil, only a slight ripple in the air, like a stone dropped into a pond. The entity smiled, a gesture that stretched the skin of Hester's face to its limits, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too numerous for a human mouth. "Iron does not touch what I am," it whispered, taking another step forward. Clara scrambled from the bed, seizing the screaming infant from the cradle and pressing him against her chest, shielding his face from the sight. "Please," she begged, her voice a high, thin squeak. "He is a child. He has done nothing." The entity paused, its black gaze shifting from the master to the mother and child. The air in the room grew heavy, the pressure causing the window panes to creak in their frames. The entity seemed to inhale the fear in the room, feeding on the terror it had generated. "He inherits the debt," the entity replied, its voice echoing with the weight of centuries. "He inherits the silence and the screams of the fields. But you are right. The child is not the architect. The architect stands before me." Thorn, realizing the bullets were useless, lunged forward in a desperate, self-sacrificing tackle, attempting to buy his wife time to escape. He struck the body of the old woman, but it was like hitting a stone pillar wrapped in cloth. He was repelled with a force that sent him flying backward, crashing into the wardrobe. He slid to the floor, dazed and gasping for air, the pistol skittering away across the floorboards. The entity did not even look at him, keeping its focus on Clara and the child. It raised a hand, and the shadows in the room solidified, forming tendrils that wrapped around Thorn's ankles and wrists, pinning him to the floor. He struggled, but the grip was cold and immovable, like iron shackles forged from the darkness itself. "You wanted efficiency, Master Thorn," the entity said, moving toward Clara with a terrifying, fluid grace. "You wanted to quantify human life. Now I will quantify yours. A life for a life. A child for a child." It reached out a finger, tracing a line down the infant's cheek. Clara screamed, a sound of pure anguish, and tried to pull away, but she was frozen in place by the entity's will. The touch was not violent, but it left a mark, a coldness that seeped into the child's bones. Nathaniel's scream stopped abruptly, replaced by a chilling, silent observation as his eyes rolled back, the irises turning a milky white. The curse had been laid, blindness for sight, darkness for the light of privilege. Suddenly, a sound pierced the oppressive atmosphere, a low rhythmic singing that drifted in through the open window. It was not the terrified whispers of the quarters, but a powerful, resonant chorus of voices, rising in unison. The entity stopped, its head snapping toward the window, the black eyes narrowing, as if stung by the light. The song was an old spiritual, a melody that carried the weight of hope and a demand for restraint. It acted as a tether, pulling at the humanity that still lingered in the vessel, anchoring the rage to the earth. The shadows in the room flickered, their grip on Thorn loosening slightly as the entity hesitated, caught between its divine purpose of annihilation and the call of the community it had been summoned to protect. The moment of hesitation allowed the pressure in the room to equalize, the crushing weight lifting just enough for rational thought to return. Thorn gasped for air, his eyes wide as he watched the internal struggle play out on Hester's face. The features softened for a fraction of a second, the terrible sharpness of the smile fading into a look of profound, ancient sorrow. "They sing for you," Thorn wheezed, the realization dawning on him. "They sing to save us." The entity turned back to him, the blackness in its eyes swirling like storm clouds. "They sing to save themselves," it corrected, the voice a mixture of the divine and the human. "They know that death is easy. Living with the memory is the true punishment." The shadows receded, slinking back into the corners, but the cold remained, a permanent scar on the atmosphere of the room. The entity stepped back from the terrified mother and the blinded child, its posture slumping slightly as the singing outside grew louder, more insistent. "This house is marked," it declared, its voice returning to the multi-layered resonance of the summoning. "What I have taken cannot be returned. What I have left will fester. You will look upon your son and see the cost of your ledger, Elias Thorn. You will rule a graveyard of your own making." With that final pronouncement, the entity turned and walked toward the door, the shadows parting to let it pass. It did not look back, leaving the family broken and shivering in the dark, the weight of the curse settling over them like a burial shroud. The climax of violence had passed, But the era of haunting had just begun. The entity descended the main staircase with a heavy, unnatural gait, the sound of each footfall echoing through the central hall like a drumbeat of judgment. It did not rush to leave. Instead, it moved with a terrifying deliberation, dragging the broken body of Hester through the corridors of power, as if conducting a final tour of the domain it had conquered. The oil lamps flickered and died as it passed, plunging the house into a darkness that seemed to breathe and pulse with independent life. In the parlor, the shadows began to coalesce, taking on the distinct, semi-solid shapes of men and women who had died in chains on the property. This spectral assembly stood in silent witness, their forms shimmering with a faint, phosphorescent light, blocking the exits and filling the room with a cold, magnetic pressure that made the air thick and difficult to breathe. Outside, the singing grew from a murmur into a roar, a collective voice that seemed to push back the unnatural gloom. The field hands, led by the driver Josiah, had gathered near the main entrance, their voices raised in a harmony that predated their arrival in Louisiana. This was not a hymn of supplication, but a song of claiming, a declaration that the spiritual ownership of Cypress Reach had shifted hands. The sound penetrated the walls of the big house, vibrating through the floorboards and resonating in the chests of the living. It served as a spiritual anchor, a chain of human will that reached into the abyss to pull the entity back from the brink of total destruction. The tension between the song of the living and the silence of the dead created a vibration that rattled the windows in their frames. Josiah, standing at the forefront of the assembly, felt the change in the atmosphere before he saw it. He stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the darkened doorway of the house, and spoke a name that had not been spoken aloud in decades, one of the old words for justice. "Hester," he called out, his voice cutting through the chanting. "The children are watching. Do not make this place a grave for the living." The entity halted in the center of the hallway, its head snapping toward the open door. The collision of the elder's voice with the entity's will caused a visible distortion in the air, a shimmering ripple like heat haze, but intensely cold. The struggle was no longer physical. It was a battle of intent, a negotiation between the hunger for retribution and the necessity of future survival. Inside the hallway, the entity shuddered violently, the blackness in its eyes swirling like storm clouds. For a moment, the vessel seemed to collapse inward, Hester's aged frame buckling under the weight of the possession. The voice that emerged was fractured, a chorus of the ancient and the immediate. "They deserve the silence," the entity hissed, the sound like tearing canvas. "They deserve the dark." But the singing outside swelled, a wave of sound that crashed against the foundations of the house. The spectral figures in the parlor flickered, their forms becoming less distinct, their hunger tempered by the living community's refusal to let the cycle of violence consume them entirely. The deadlock held, the air pressure in the house mounting until it felt as though the walls might burst outward from the strain. The entity stepped onto the gallery, the moonlight illuminating the ruin of Hester's back and the terrifying stillness of her face. It looked out over the crowd of terrified, singing laborers, its gaze sweeping over them with a predatory intensity. The chill radiating from the steps caused frost to form on the railing, creeping down the steps like slow-moving ivy. Josiah did not flinch. He stepped closer, his hands raised, palms open in a gesture of peace and offering. "We do not need another death to know our worth," he shouted, his voice steady despite the freezing air. "We need the land. We need the future. Leave the master to live with what he has done." This appeal to enduring punishment, rather than immediate execution, struck a chord, shifting the moral calculus of the haunting. The entity paused, its head tilting to the side as it considered the elder's words. The shadows behind it writhed, lashing out at the air in frustration, but they could not advance past the threshold where the moonlight met the porch. Living with the guilt is the sentence, Josiah continued, stepping even closer, his breath misting in the frigid air. Let him rebuild what he broke. Let him pay the debt in labor and in change. Death is too quick for a man who counts souls as currency. The crowd murmured in agreement, the chanting softening into a low rhythmic hum that seemed to stabilize the very ground beneath them. The suggestion of a living penance introduced a new variable into the spiritual equation, a form of justice that extended beyond the grave. A low rumbling sigh escaped the entity, a sound that carried the weight of centuries of suffering. A debt unpaid is a chain that never breaks, the entity intoned, its voice losing some of its multi-layered resonance, becoming more human, more tired. He will be watched. The land will remember. If the bargain is broken, I will return. This was the concession, the codicil to the sentence that had been passed. The entity raised a hand, pointing a gnarled finger not at Thorn, who was cowering in the doorway, but at the ground itself. This earth is mine now. The memory is mine. You walk on my patience. The pronouncement sealed the fate of the plantation, transforming it from a place of commerce into a shrine of remembrance. With the terms established, the possession began to recede. The entity's rigid posture slackened, the terrible straightness of the spine collapsing into the bent, broken form of the old woman. The blackness in the eyes faded, replaced by the clouded, roomy gaze of Hester, though now filled with a profound exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue. She swayed on the top step, catching herself on the railing, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The spectral figures in the parlor dissolved into wisps of smoke, retreating into the corners and crevices of the house, becoming a presence felt rather than seen. The immediate threat of annihilation had passed, leaving behind a ringing silence that was heavier than the previous noise. Josiah rushed forward, climbing the steps with a speed that belied his years, and caught Hester just as her knees gave way. He held her gently, supporting her weight against his chest. "It is done," he whispered, though whether to her or to the watching shadows, it was unclear. The other workers surged forward, surrounding the pair, forming a protective barrier between the vessel and the master, who stood paralyzed in the doorway. They bore her away from the big house, a procession of triumph and sorrow, carrying the woman who had dared to call down a god. The transition from the height of supernatural terror to the aftermath of human consequence was jarring, a sudden return to the weight of gravity and history. As they carried Hester toward the quarters, she stirred, her hand feebly grasping Josiah's arm. "The boy," she rasped, her voice barely audible above the whisper of the wind. "He sees the truth now. Use it." She was delirious, drifting in and out of consciousness, but the message was clear. The curse on the infant was not merely a punishment, but a tool. The blindness of the heir was a tether to the spiritual reality of the plantation, a constant reminder that the Thorne family would never again be able to ignore the cost of their position. The child would serve as a living monument to the events of the night, a witness to the unseen. The crowd laid Hester on a pallet in the largest cabin, where the healers immediately began to tend to her wounds, though they knew that the damage went far beyond the flesh. Elias Thorne remained on the porch of the big house, frozen in place, watching the retreat of his property with a hollow gaze. The sun began to crest over the tree line, casting a pale, watery light over the frost-covered grass. The unnatural chill recorded in the diaries began to lift, but the air remained sharp, biting. The plantation was calm, but it was the calm of a cemetery after the funeral. a silence heavy with the weight of the departed and the obligations of the living. The finality of the night settled over Cypress Reach like a shroud. The shadows in the field seemed to stretch longer than usual, reaching toward the big house with grasping fingers. The overseers, those who had survived, were nowhere to be seen, having fled to the safety of the river road or hidden themselves in the barns. The power dynamic had shifted irrevocably, though no legal document had been signed. The master stood alone in his fine clothes, shivering in the morning air, while the enslaved community gathered in their quarters, singing softly over the broken body of their savior. The haunting had not ended. It had simply moved indoors, taking up residence in the walls of the house and the hearts of its inhabitants. The bargain was struck, and the watch had begun. Hester did not rise again. She lingered for 3 days in the large cabin, her breathing shallow and erratic, while a constant stream of visitors passed through, leaving small offerings of herbs and river stones at the threshold. The official death record, filed belatedly with the parish clerk, listed the cause as heart failure due to advanced age, a bureaucratic euphemism that ignored the ruin of her back and the supernatural exertion of the possession. Her passing on the 4th morning was quiet, a mere cessation of breath that went unnoticed by the overseers, but sent a ripple of mourning through the quarters. The women prepared her body with reverence, wrapping her in a clean linen shroud, their movements synchronized by a heavy communal grief that felt more like the foundation of a new religion than a simple funeral rite. The burial took place in the dead ground behind the quarters, a patch of earth near the edge of the swamp where the soil was dark and rich. There were no coffins available for the enslaved, so Hester was lowered into the red clay, wrapped only in her shroud, her body returning to the same soil she had called upon during the summoning. The service was brief, as the threat of overseer interference loomed, but the spiritual weight of the moment was undeniable. As the first shovelfuls of dirt struck the linen, a collective gasp went up from the mourners. The ground seemed to reject the earth, the soil shifting and sliding away from the body, as if repelled by a magnetic force, requiring the gravediggers to tamp it down with excessive force to achieve a level surface. Almost immediately, the gravesite began to exhibit properties that defied the agricultural history of the region. Within a week, a circular patch of barrenness radiated outward from the burial spot, killing the hardy crabgrass and witchgrass that typically choked the area. Gardeners employed by the Thorne family later confirmed that the earth had become chemically inert in that specific radius, refusing to support even the most rudimentary plant life. It was as if the nutrients had been incinerated from the soil, leaving behind a scar of absolute sterility. This physical anomaly served as a constant, visible reminder that the events of the haunting were not confined to the past, but were an ongoing, active presence in the landscape. Elias Thorne, seeking to reassert control over a reality that had slipped its moorings, dispatched a letter to the Bishop of New Orleans on the 5th day following the burial. The correspondence, preserved in the diocesan archives, requested an immediate spiritual cleansing of the property, citing unusual disturbances and a profound sense of oppression. Thorne abandoned his usual tone of detached rationalism, instead employing the desperate, pleading language of a man under siege. He pleaded for a priest capable of dealing with ancient malice, unwittingly admitting that his own faith lacked the authority to cleanse the stain he had provoked. The letter marked the first public acknowledgement from the master that the plantation's crisis was metaphysical rather than managerial. The response arrived in the form of Father Marin, a Jesuit scholar of 62 winters, known for his interest in the primitive traditions of the Louisiana Territory. He arrived at Cypress Reach with a leather satchel filled with holy water, Latin texts, and a skepticism that eroded rapidly upon setting foot on the soil. Historical accounts from the period note that Marin spent 3 days conducting interviews with the field hands and examining the big house, where the temperature remained perpetually low despite the burning of the hearths. He approached the haunting with the rigor of a detective, cataloging the physical manifestations, the frosted glass, the moving shadows, and the blindness of the infant Nathaniel, before attempting any ritual intervention. On the evening of his 3rd day, Marin attempted a blessing of the main house, reciting the Roman ritual of exorcism over the threshold. The results were immediate and disheartening for the cleric. The holy water sizzled upon contact with the floorboards, evaporating into a noxious, sulfurous steam that caused the priest to recoil in a fit of coughing. The Latin invocations seemed to fall flat, the syllables absorbed by the heavy silence of the walls rather than echoing with divine resonance. Marin ceased the ritual abruptly, his face pale, declaring that the forces present were not demonic in the traditional sense and therefore not subject to the jurisdiction of the Church. Marin departed the next morning, leaving behind a written assessment that would later trouble the Thorn family for generations. In his report, he clarified that the entity was not a demon to be cast out, but a genius loci, a spirit of place that had been awakened by blood and injustice. He explained that the Christian God held no authority over the ancient pacts made by the land's original guardians. The priest advised Thorn that no amount of prayer or ritual could dislodge a power that had been invited in through the suffering of the innocent. The theological implication was clear. The plantation was no longer merely a piece of property. It was a temple to an older, darker faith. With the failure of the religious intervention, the psychological toll on the Thorn family began to manifest in physical ways. Clara Thorn refused to leave the upper floors, convinced that the shadows in the garden were watching her movements. She wrote to her sister in Natchez, describing a persistent surveillance that made her skin crawl even in the safety of her bedroom. The infant, Nathaniel, though silent, developed a habit of turning his head toward the corners of the room, tracking invisible movements with his blind, milky eyes. The family was effectively under house arrest, confined by a fear that had no name and no remedy, trapped in a structure that had become an extension of the entity's will. Elias Thorn attempted to return to the management of the crops, hoping that the routine of agriculture would normalize the atmosphere. However, the ledgers from that season show a sharp decline in productivity, attributed not to weather or labor shortages, but to a pervasive reluctance among the workforce to engage deeply with the land. The enslaved population moved with a cautious efficiency, avoiding the edges of the fields and speaking in hushed tones. They understood that the master no longer ruled Cypress Reach. He was merely a tenant, living on the sufferance of the entity that Hester had summoned. The hierarchy had been broken, replaced by a silent, spiritual partnership between the workers and the unseen. The most profound shift occurred in the relationship between the living and the dead. The workers began to leave small offerings at Hester's barren grave, pouches of tobacco, smooth stones, and bits of ribbon, treating the site not as a cemetery, but as a shrine. This practice, documented in the oral histories of the region, represented a radical reclamation of spiritual autonomy. The master's authority had been superseded by a power that answered to the oppressed, creating a sanctuary within the borders of the plantation. The fear that had once kept them in chains was transformed into a protective barrier, a shared understanding that the entity was a guardian that required respect. The silence of the plantation was frequently broken by a strange, resonant humming that seemed to emanate from the earth itself, particularly near the site of the cane field where Hester had performed the summoning. Thorn wrote in his journal that the sound was audible even in the big house, a low-frequency vibration that rattled the teacups in the china cabinet. It was a metronomic reminder of the debt that was still owed, a constant background noise to the life of the master. The haunting had settled into the infrastructure of the estate, becoming a permanent feature of the environment, as natural and unchangeable as the flow of the river or the heat of the sun. The realization began to dawn on Thorne that the only path forward was not to fight the haunting, but to appease it through a fundamental change in his own behavior. The ledgers for the latter half of 1839 reveal a distinct shift in the operational expenditures of Cypress Reach, marked by a sudden cessation of payments for disciplinary services. Elias Thorne, driven by a terror that outweighed his greed, issued a standing order prohibiting the use of the whip without his explicit written authorization. This was a pragmatic retreat rather than a moral awakening. The master sought to starve the entity of the suffering it fed upon. The overseers, confused and emboldened by the lack of clear direction, initially resisted the change, viewing leniency as a precursor to rebellion. However, Thorne enforced his mandate with a paranoid intensity, firing 2 men who attempted to circumvent the new protocol, creating a vacuum of authority in the fields. This withdrawal of violence did not bring peace to the big house, but rather a suffocating period of watchful waiting. Thorne began to patrol the property at irregular intervals, carrying a loaded pistol and a notebook, documenting every anomaly he encountered. He recorded instances of frost on the window panes in July, the sound of footsteps in the empty attic, and the uncanny stillness of the birds near the main house. His writings transformed from agricultural logs into a chronicle of paranoia, a desperate attempt to quantify the unquantifiable. He was attempting to manage the supernatural threat as he would a crop blight, believing that if he could simply reduce the inputs of pain, the output of haunting would diminish correspondingly. The entity, however, was not subject to the laws of accounting. One humid evening in late August, Thorne sat in his study, attempting to balance the quarterly books when the temperature in the room plummeted, causing the ink to thicken in his well. The shadows in the corners of the room elongated, stretching across the Persian rug like spilling oil. A voice, emanating from the air itself, interrupted his calculations. "You count coppers and cents," the entity murmured, its tone devoid of emotion, but heavy with judgment. "You tally the cost of bread and cloth, yet you fail to calculate the price of the air you breathe." The rebuke was clear. The master's superficial reforms were insufficient to balance the moral debt that had accumulated over decades of cruelty. Thorne dropped his pen, the ink blotching the page, and addressed the empty room. "I have stopped the whipping," he stammered, his voice trembling. "I have improved the rations. The bargain holds." He viewed his actions as a transaction, a payment made to secure a service, namely, the cessation of the haunting. He believed that by reducing the physical cruelty, he had satisfied the requirements of the curse. But the entity's presence only grew heavier, a crushing weight on his chest that made it difficult to draw breath. The master's logic was being dismantled by a power that operated on a different economy, one where the currency was justice, not comfort. "Better chains are still chains," the voice replied, resonating from the mahogany bookshelves. "You treat the symptoms to cure the disease, but the disease is your ownership. You believe that by being a gentler jailer, you absolve yourself of the crime of imprisonment." The entity materialized partially in the reflection of the darkened window, a tall, distorted shadow that loomed over Thorne's shoulder. It pointed a translucent finger at the ledger on the desk. "These numbers are lies. You cannot write your way out of what you are. You cannot manage evil into mediocrity." The confrontation was a direct assault on Thorne's identity. He was being told that his very existence as a master was the offense, regardless of how he conducted himself. The pressure in the room intensified, forcing Thorne to grip the edge of his desk to steady himself. "What would you have me do?" he shouted, his composure finally shattering. "Release them all into a society that will lynch them. Starve them by abandoning the harvest?" He retreated into the paternalistic argument that had justified slavery for generations, framing his tyranny as protection. But the entity offered no quarter. It demanded a complete abdication of the power dynamic, a surrender of the assumption that Thorne knew what was best for the people he claimed to own. The haunting had evolved from a spectral nuisance into a moral tribunal, forcing the master to defend his soul against charges he could not answer. "You fear the loss of your position more than you fear the judgment of your God," the entity observed, its voice lowering to a whisper that was more terrifying than a shout. "You calculate the risks of freedom, but you do not calculate the risks of continued bondage. The reckoning is coming, Elias. It is not a matter of if, but when. And when it arrives, you will have no ledger thick enough to hide behind." The shadow in the window pulsed, expanding until it blocked out the moonlight entirely. The warning was stark. The current equilibrium was temporary, a stay of execution contingent upon a transformation that Thorne had not yet begun to fathom. The following morning, Thorne emerged from his study pale and haggard, his clothes rumpled from a sleepless night. He sought out Josiah, who was overseeing a repair on the sugar mill, approaching the man not as a master, addressing a subordinate, but as a supplicant seeking counsel. This interaction, noted in the memoirs of a visiting cousin, broke the rigid social code of the antebellum South. Thorne asked the elder if the community felt the entity's presence as acutely as he did, attempting to gauge if the haunting was a shared burden or a targeted punishment. Josiah's response was measured but pointed. He confirmed that the spirit was at peace with the workers, acting as a shield rather than a tormentor, highlighting the stark division in the plantation's new reality. Thorne returned to the big house, his mind racing. He realized that the entity had erected a spiritual hierarchy that inverted the physical one. The enslaved community, once at the bottom of the social order, now possessed a direct connection to the land's supernatural authority. Thorne was the outlier, the intruder, in his own home, living on the margins of a power structure he could not control. The psychological strain of this inversion manifested in a constant, low-grade anxiety. He second-guessed every order, fearing that a harsh word or a selfish decision would trigger the entity's wrath. He was no longer the architect of his destiny, but a caretaker walking on eggshells. In a desperate bid to demonstrate his willingness to change, Thorne ordered the construction of a new infirmary in the quarters, funding it from his own diminishing capital. He hired a doctor from Natchez to visit the plantation monthly, a significant expense that drew concerned letters from his financial advisors. The doctor's bills, preserved in the estate records, show a sudden spike in medical attendance, a clear deviation from the previous policy of neglect. Thorne was attempting to purchase grace, treating the health of his workforce as an investment in his own survival. He hovered over the construction, ensuring the materials were of high quality, obsessed with the physical manifestation of his newfound caution. Yet, for every step Thorne took toward benevolence, the entity remained a silent, judgmental observer. The cold spots in the hallway did not recede. The frost on the windows did not melt. The master was being held in a state of probation. His actions weighed on a scale that seemed to lack a 0 point. He was trapped in a cycle of trying, failing, and trying again, with no clear indication of what would constitute success. The moral thesis of the haunting was relentless. Structural change was mandatory. and the master's fear was the only engine driving the transformation. The climax of this phase of probation arrived on a rainy Tuesday, when Thorn found a message scratched into the dust on his bedside table. It was not written in the dramatic scrawl of the previous warnings, but in a neat, chilling script. "The attempt is noted," it read, "but the attempt is not the deed. You cannot inherit righteousness. You must create it." The message solidified the central conflict of Thorn's existence. He realized that he would never be free of the surveillance until he dismantled the very system that had birthed the entity. The haunting was not a problem to be solved, but a new state of being that demanded a total reinvention of his world. The transition from paranoid autocrat to reluctant reformer reached its structural breaking point on a gray morning in January of 1840, when Elias Thorn convened an unprecedented assembly in the threshing barn. He stood before the entirety of his labor force, some 62 souls according to the most recent census, not on the raised platform usually reserved for the master, but on the earthen floor among them. The pseudo-documentary record, pieced together from oral histories, suggests he carried no ledger, no whip, and no weapon. His address was halting and devoid of the rehearsed rhetoric of the planter class. He posed a question that had not been uttered on Cypress Reach in its 40-year history. What is it that you require to live as human beings? The silence that followed was heavy and skeptical. The workers had witnessed brief fits of conscience from masters before, usually born of fever or age, but this was different. Thorn was a young man, barely 30, and his fear was not of death, but of the entity that watched from the periphery. Josiah, acting as the unspoken representative of the community, stepped forward. He did not thank the master for his inquiry. Instead, he delivered a clinical list of demands: the cessation of all corporal punishment, the right to cultivate private gardens, and, most radically, a wage for labor, rendered. The atmosphere in the barn tightened as the words hung in the damp air, challenging the very economic foundation of the plantation. Thorn listened without interruption, his face a mask of concentration rather than offense. When Josiah finished, Thorn did not argue the legality of the demands or cite the economic impossibility of wages. Instead, he admitted his ignorance. "I have been taught to manage property, not people," he confessed, his voice low. "I do not know how to structure this, but I know that the old way is closed to me." He asked for their patience and their input, a deference that shocked the overseers lurking at the back of the barn. This was the pivotal moment where the protagonist shifted from being an antagonist of the system to a partner in its dismantling, motivated by the terrifying reality of the supernatural bargain. Over the next 6 weeks, the big house became a site of intense, improvised legislative work. Thorn engaged the services of a lawyer from Natchez, a man known for radical leanings, to draft a charter of cooperative labor. The resulting document, filed with the local magistrate in the spring of 1840, was a legal oddity that baffled the planners in the region. It stipulated that the workers were no longer chattel, but contracted employees, entitled to a percentage of the net profits from the sugar harvest. While Thorn retained title to the land, the charter established a trust that would gradually transfer ownership of the machinery and draft animals to the labor collective over a period of 20 years. The financial implications of this restructuring were immediate and severe. Thorn's liquid capital, once substantial, evaporated as he retroactively paid wages for the current season and invested in the infrastructure requested by the workers. Bankers in New Orleans, reviewing his revised balance sheets, noted a decline in assets valued at nearly half of the estate's total worth. Correspondence from the period reveals Thorn's desperation to sell off non-essential furnishings from the big house to cover the initial outlay. He was, in effect, buying his own survival at the cost of his status, trading the opulence of the planter aristocracy for the modest sustainability of a partnership. The reaction from the neighboring estates was swift and vitriolic. Thorne was effectively ostracized from the social fabric of the Red River planter class. Invitations to hunt or dine ceased abruptly, and the local church suggested that his presence might be disruptive to the congregation. The social quarantine was a calculated punishment, intended to starve the aberration back into conformity. Yet, Thorne found a strange peace in the isolation. Freed from the performative expectations of his peers, he could focus entirely on the microeconomics of the plantation, which began to show signs of stabilization due to the increased efficiency of voluntary labor. The internal dynamic of the labor force shifted as the reality of autonomy set in. The workers, now stakeholders, approached the fields with a predatory attention to detail that overseers had never managed to extract with the whip. Josiah organized a labor council to allocate tasks, rotating the arduous work of the mill and the fields to ensure fairness. This self-governance eliminated the need for Thorne's direct supervision in daily operations, reducing him to a logistical administrator who negotiated contracts with riverboat captains and suppliers. The hierarchy had flattened, creating a vacuum of authority that the community filled with collective decision-making. The transition was not without friction. Decades of enforced subservience had left psychological scars that manifest in a reluctance to trust the master's intentions. Minor disputes over crop allocation and work hours arose, testing the resilience of the new charter. In one instance, recorded in the council minutes, a dispute over tool maintenance threatened to halt work in the cane fields. Thorne, instead of issuing a decree, deferred to the judgment of the council, accepting their ruling even when it cost him time and money. This submission was the crucible of his transformation, proving that he respected the agency of his partners over his own authority. The entity's presence during this period evolved from a constant pressure into a distant, watchful silence. The frost retreated from the big house, and the shadows in the corners seemed less aggressive, as if acknowledging the structural changes taking place. Thorne interpreted this quietude not as forgiveness, but as a tentative acceptance of the new terms. He lived in a state of suspended judgment, aware that the entity's patience was infinite, and that any backsliding into tyranny would result in immediate and catastrophic retribution. The haunting had successfully enforced a moral correction that the laws of the state had failed to mandate. Clara Thorne, observing her husband's transformation from the sidelines, found her own role redefined. No longer the mistress of a patriarchal domain, she began to teach, utilizing the forbidden books from Elias's library to conduct lessons in a converted storage room. The school, illegal under the statutes of the time, operated with the silent approval of Thorne, who saw education as the necessary corollary to economic freedom. This added layer of subversion further cemented the plantation's status as an anomaly in the Deep South, a beacon of a possible future that the surrounding region was desperate to extinguish. By the winter of 1840, Cypress Reach had established a rhythm that resembled a functional, if uneasy, cooperative rather than a slave plantation. The harvest, though smaller in volume than the brutal peak years of the previous decade, yielded a higher quality of sugar, commanding premium prices in the markets of New Orleans. The workers took pride in the product, seeing the fruits of their labor reflected in their own ledgers rather than their masters'. The experiment was proving that the economy of fear was not only immoral, but inefficient, a lesson that Thorne had learned at the point of a spiritual knife. The fragile peace was shattered when a rider arrived with a sealed message from a consortium of neighboring planters. The letter, written in elegant but menacing script, referred to the contamination spreading from Cypress Reach and demanded a meeting to restore the natural order of the river parishes. Thorne read the message in his study, the paper trembling in his hands. He knew that the outside world would not tolerate the existence of a free black cooperative in the heart of the slaveholding South. The entity had forced him to build a sanctuary, but now he had to defend it against a society that viewed its very existence as a threat. The trial of the new order was about to begin. The threat materialized on a slate-gray afternoon in November of 1840, when a column of riders appeared on the levee road, kicking up dust that settled like a warning over the cane fields. The group, numbering 23 men according to the count taken by Josiah from the bell tower, represented the consolidated authority of the neighboring plantations. They were led by Augustin St. Clair, a planter whose reputation for ruthlessness was documented in several abolitionist pamphlets of the era. The men were not simply a social committee. They carried rifles across their saddles and coils of rope tied to their pommels, the tools of a specific and terrifying trade. They brought with them the weight of the outside world, a world that refused to countenance the anomaly of Cypress Reach. St. Clair reined his horse to a halt at the main gate, his posture radiating the confidence of a man enforcing natural law. He called out for Thorne, his voice booming across the silent yard with the cadence of a sermon. Thorne emerged from the big house, flanked not by overseers, but by Josiah and several other members of the Workers' Council. The master walked with a stiff, unnatural gait, his face pale, but his jaw set in a rigid line. The confrontation was starkly different from the shouting matches of the past. This was a collision between the old order of iron and whip and the new order of contract and spirit. St. Clair did not dismount, preferring to look down on Thorne from the height of his saddle, a visual assertion of the dominance he assumed was his birthright. "You have created a poison in the body of our society, Thorne," St. Clair announced, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "We are here to lance the boil. You will sign these people back into their proper condition, or we will impose the condition upon them ourselves." The demand was absolute, requiring a total surrender of the cooperative and a return to the economy of human chattel. The riders behind him shifted restlessly, their eyes scanning the quarters for signs of resistance, eager for a justification to unleash violence. The tension was a physical weight, pressing down on the shoulders of the Cypress Reach community, testing the resolve of their fragile freedom. Thorne did not reach for a weapon, nor did he attempt to argue the legalities of his charter. He knew that the law of the state was written in the blood of the oppressed and enforced by men like St. Clair. Instead, he simply refused. "Cypress Reach is closed to you," he stated, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "These people are free under the terms of a registered trust. You have no jurisdiction here." It was a defiance that bordered on self-destructive, a rejection of the social contract that bound the planter class together. St. Clair's face darkened, his benevolence evaporating into a cold, sharp malice that promised retribution. "If the law will not correct you, then the rope must," St. Clair replied, signaling his men to dismount. The movement was synchronized, the practiced efficiency of a militia. As their boots hit the ground, the environment on the plantation shifted with a violent suddenness that defied meteorological explanation. The ambient temperature plummeted, dropping 20 degrees in a matter of seconds. The horses, sensing a predator that their riders could not see, began to whinny and rear, their eyes rolling white with panic. A heavy, unnatural fog began to roll in from the river, obscuring the levee road and muffling the sounds of the men preparing for violence. From the direction of Hester's barren grave, a low-frequency vibration began to shake the earth. It was not an earthquake in the geological sense, but a localized disturbance that caused the peeling paint on the shed to rattle. and the loose boards of the gallery to groan. The entity was not merely watching, it was rising. Josiah stepped back from Thorne's side, bowing his head in a gesture of acknowledgement, signaling the community to retreat. They knew what was coming. They had fed the soil with their suffering, and now the soil was answering the call to arms. The shadows in the yard detached themselves from the objects that cast them, pooling together to form a darkness that seemed to swallow the fading light of the afternoon. From this abyss, shapes began to manifest, first translucent and shimmering, then solidifying into the distinct forms of men and women. These were not the vague ghosts of folklore, but the specific and detailed apparitions of the plantation's dead. Historical oral accounts describe the appearance of individuals who had died in the cane fields, their spectral bodies bearing the wounds that had killed them, their eyes burning with a cold, blue fire. They moved with a silent gliding motion that ignored the laws of friction or gravity. St. Clair and his men froze, their hands frozen on their rifle stocks as the temperature dropped to the freezing point. Frost began to crystallize on the whiskers of the horses and the brims of the men's hats. The spectral army, numbering in the dozens, formed a phalanx between the invaders and the quarters. The air pressure dropped so drastically that several of the men grabbed their ears in pain, their eardrums straining against the vacuum. The assault on their senses was total, bypassing their martial training and striking directly at the primitive fear centers of their brains. The entity manifested in the center of the yard, appearing as a towering pillar of darkness that stretched upward, blotting out the gray sky. Its voice did not come from a single throat, but emanated from the rustling of the cane, the lapping of the river, and the creaking of the big house's timbers. "You come to reclaim what was never yours," the voice intoned, resonating in the chests of the riders. "You seek to bind those who have already been claimed by a higher authority." The sheer magnitude of the presence was overwhelming, a crushing weight of ancient judgment that made the planters' economic power look like a child's game. One of the riders, panic overriding his discipline, raised his rifle and fired at the nearest spectral figure. The bullet passed through the mist and struck the ground harmlessly. In response, the apparition turned, its face a mask of serene fury, and pointed a translucent finger at the shooter. The man's horse collapsed beneath him, not from injury, but from sheer cardiac arrest, its heart stopped by the proximity to such concentrated otherness. The rider scrambled backward in the dirt, screaming in a language that was no longer English, his mind fracturing under the strain of the encounter. "Go," the entity commanded, the single word striking like a physical blow. "Go and tell them that Cypress Reach is the boundary. Tell them that the debt is being collected, and the currency is fear." St. Clair, his face drained of blood, and his eyes wide with a terror he would never fully recover from, scrambled back onto his terrified mount. He did not need to be told twice. The supernatural display had shattered his worldview, proving that there were forces in the universe far more terrible than a plantation master's whip. The mob fled in a chaotic rout, their discipline shattered, riding hard for the levee road, as if the devil himself were snapping at their horses' hooves. They left behind their dropped weapons and their wounded pride, fleeing the haunted sanctuary they had sought to destroy. As quickly as it had appeared, the mist began to lift, and the spectral army faded back into the shadows and the earth. The temperature began a slow, painful climb back to normalcy, leaving the yard silent and empty, save for the bodies of the dead horses. The defense had been successful, achieved through terror rather than bloodshed, a demonstration of power that would ensure the plantation's isolation for years to come. The entity had held the line, and the covenant of the cooperative remained unbroken. The immediate aftermath of the confrontation brought a silence to Cypress Reach that was distinct from the oppressive quiet of the haunting. This was a silence of survival, heavy and exhausted. Elias Thorne stood on the gallery, watching the dust settle on the levee road, his hands still trembling from the proximity to the entity's manifestation. The defense of the plantation had cost him his standing in the world of men, but it had purchased a sovereign immunity that no lawyer could draft and no militia could breach. The workers moved cautiously back to their tasks, their movements betraying a new awareness of the land beneath their feet, a realization that the soil itself was an active combatant in their struggle for liberty. News of the route traveled faster than the riders themselves, carried by the network of rivermen and traders who whispered of the haunted plantation, where the dead walked to defend the living. The story grew in the telling, expanding from a skirmish into a legend of divine retribution. Within a month, Cypress Reach had become a geographical anomaly on the maps of the planter class, a place to be circumvented rather than traversed. The isolation that had begun as a social punishment transformed into a protective barrier, allowing the cooperative to operate without the constant interference of the outside world. Thorne noted in his journal that the fear of the entity was a more effective border control than any fence or guard dog could ever be. The economic reality of the plantation, however, required a navigation of this new isolation. The cooperative produced a high-quality sugar, but the traditional markets in the city were now closed to them, as no respectable factor would do business with a man rumored to be in league with African demons. Thorne and the Labor Council were forced to innovate, establishing direct trade routes with underground abolitionist networks in the north. These transactions were risky, involving smuggling the crop northward via the Red River under the cover of darkness. The ledgers from this period show a decline in total volume, but a surprising stability in profit, as the high quality of their labor commanded premium prices in markets starved for ethically produced goods. Thorne's personal life contracted into the dimensions of the estate. He no longer traveled to New Orleans for the social season, nor did he entertain guests at the big house. The building itself had changed. The rooms that had once hosted dances and dinners were now largely silent, occupied only by the lingering chill of the haunting. Clara Thorne, however, found a new purpose within these walls. Her school, once a clandestine operation, became a central institution of the plantation. She taught reading and ciphering to the children of the cooperative, preparing them for a world that the adults hoped would one day be open to them. The sight of the mistress of the house teaching the children of her former property was a daily rebuke to the social order that St. Clair had tried to enforce. Nathaniel Thorne, the blind heir, grew into a strange and solitary child. His lack of sight seemed to heighten his other perceptions to a supernatural degree. He would often be found sitting in the garden, his face turned toward the sky, describing the movement of birds he could not possibly see or the color of the wind. The workers treated him with a mixture of pity and reverence, believing that he was marked by the entity, a living barometer of the plantation's spiritual health. Thorne watched his son with a complex mix of guilt and awe, knowing that the boy's affliction was the price of the family's survival, a constant reminder of the bargain that had been struck in blood. The relationship between Thorne and the Labor Council evolved into a functional, if distant, partnership. Josiah acted as the primary intermediary, bridging the gap between the former master's administrative knowledge and the workers' practical expertise. They met weekly in the threshing barn to discuss the allocation of resources, the rotation of crops, and the maintenance of the sugar mill. These meetings were conducted with a democratic rigor that would have been unthinkable a decade prior. Thorne's vote was no more weighty than Josiah's, a surrender of privilege that he accepted without complaint, knowing that the entity was watching the balance sheet of justice as closely as it watched the financial accounts. The seasons turned, and the haunting settled into a rhythm, becoming a part of the plantation's ecosystem. The cold spots in the big house were simply avoided, and the strange sounds in the attic were acknowledged with a nod. The workers maintained Hester's grave, which remained a barren circle of black earth in the lush green of the yard. They left offerings there not out of fear, but out of gratitude. The site became a shrine, a place where people would go to seek guidance or comfort, believing that the old woman's spirit still lingered as a benevolent guardian. The theology of the plantation was no longer Christian. It was a syncretic faith born of necessity and power. Thorne's health began to decline in the winter of 1842, a decline that his doctors attributed to nerves, but which he knew was the slow drain of the curse. He wrote his will with a lawyer who refused to step foot on the property, meeting the man on the riverboat instead. The document ensured that the cooperative structure would survive his death, legally transferring the title of the land to the trust managed by the workers. It was his final act of restitution, an attempt to balance a ledger that could never truly be settled. He signed the papers with a hand that shook, not from fear, but from the profound exhaustion of a man who had carried the weight of a moral revolution. As he lay dying in the spring of the following year, Thorne requested to be carried to the gallery so he could look out over the fields one last time. He saw the cane swaying in the breeze, the workers moving between the rows with a dignity that was no longer performative. He saw Josiah standing by the bell tower, an old man now, but strong and unbowed. And in the shadows of the porch, he saw the darkness shift, the entity manifesting to collect its due. Thorne did not flinch. He closed his eyes and offered a final, silent apology to Hester, to the nameless dead, and to the boy who would never see the world he was changing. The entity did not speak, but its presence was a cold comfort, a confirmation that the bargain had been shorted. Thorne passed away as the sun set, the light dying on the river, and casting long shadows across the land he had surrendered. His death was not mourned with the fanfare of a patriarch, but it was noted with respect by the community he had wronged and then served. The cooperative did not collapse. In fact, the removal of the white master seemed to strengthen the resolve of the workers, who now operated the estate entirely for their own benefit. In the years that followed, Cypress Reach became a myth in the geography of the South. It was a place of whispered stories, a Noah's Ark of liberty hidden in a sea of bondage. The entity remained, a silent watcher in the cane fields, ensuring that no chain was ever forged on that soil again. The legend grew that the plantation was protected by a dark angel, a story that kept the slave catchers and the bigots at bay. The legacy of Hester and Elias Thorne was not one of simple heroism or villainy, but of a terrible necessary alchemy that had transmuted suffering into freedom. The haunting was no longer a curse, it was the cornerstone of their liberty.